Our next speaker is Elizabeth Frazier. Elizabeth, or Beth as we know her, is an attorney at Pierce Atwood and has been MEREDA's lobbyist in Augusta for 8 years. In those 8 years, Beth has made major headway in housing policy and, with the state's newfound focus and increased funding towards housing, she has many new, exciting housing policies on the horizon. Beth is very involved with MEREDA's public policy and local issues committees, and we are extremely lucky to have Beth on the team. Beth is going to share some insights into the housing legislative action that is currently happening at the state level and how those policies would impact housing if enacted. Please welcome Beth to the stage.
Good afternoon. Good to see everyone. My name is Elizabeth Frazier. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, all right, there we go. My name is Elizabeth Frazier, and I am an attorney at Pierce Atwood. I am also, for those of you who might be familiar with the term, a lobbyist, which is what I spend a lot of my time doing in Augusta, also known as a government relations advocate, which is a term that I prefer because it comes with less negative connotation. But I'd love to talk to you a little bit today about what the state of Maine is doing in terms of housing policy at a statewide level. I am going to touch upon how that interacts with local policies because obviously the two are pretty entwined. So I thought it might be helpful to give you a little bit of a historical look at what the state's role has been in policy with respect to land use and housing. And I thought I might start by sort of giving you the most basic framework I could possibly imagine, which is that we hear a lot about local control. The Constitution of Maine essentially says, and I'm paraphrasing, that localities and towns have the power to amend their charter on all matters not prohibited by the Constitution or general law, I'm going to get back to that, which are local and municipal in character. And that local and municipal in character piece has driven a lot of why towns control their local zoning, and it's the piece that sort of has kept the state out of it by and large for a long time. It also means that the state has to kind of demonstrate an interest in order to step on what would otherwise be, local and municipal in character. So obviously there's a big debate about home rule and how far it really extends and what that means, and I'm not going to get into that here today. But I did think I'd talk a little bit about how it has changed over the years. So historically, towns have been primarily the drivers of land use policy. Those things have been, going back right 150 years ago, certainly very local in character and nature. By the time you get to the 1960s, the state's interest is a little bit bigger because we now have housing that we want to ensure is safe. We want to make sure that, the citizens that are living in this town that are now driving all over the place aren't, barging into other towns and causing trouble in those towns. In other words, human connectivity really started to change the sort of pure local nature of housing and land use, and the state had a slightly larger interest, predominantly in, I would say, the areas of public health and safety and environmental protection. And so what does that mean? So in the early 1960s, these things start to percolate. Obviously, this was also sort of the early 1960s and 60s was sort of the birth of the modern bureaucracy too. So you're going to hear a few things that sound very bureaucratic. In 1968, the State Planning Office opened. The State Planning Office was sort of the first foray into the state recognizing that it had some interest in what was going on at the localities. In 1971, the state of Maine passed the Shoreland Zoning Act. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that. That is essentially a zoning overlay that overrides local zoning control in areas specifically around the shoreland zone, which includes both freshwater and saltwater bodies. In 1988, the Growth Management Act was passed. It was intended at the time to prevent sprawl, but it also assumed that subdivisions, single-family subdivisions, are and would always be the future of housing in Maine. Not surprisingly, 1 year later, in 1988, we got the Maine subdivision law, and that is a state subdivision requirement that to some extent provides guidance to towns, but also overlays, and there are some sort of redundancies in that law. And then in 2010, which was sort of the last really big sort of program from a statewide level, we got the Maine Uniform Building and Energy Code. And that was the building code piece of the puzzle, and that really speaks to sort of the public health piece of the state's interest. And for the next 25 years, the state's land use policy pretty much focused on amending those laws I just named. Amending them to beef them up, to beef up the environmental aspects, to make the standards more aggressive, in an effort to, a good faith effort to protect Maine's environment at a time when not a lot of people were moving here, and there wasn't a tremendous amount of demand for development. Unfortunately, in all of those efforts to protect the environment and do good things, we also created a lot of barriers to housing creation, and we empowered NIMBYs. So from 2001 to 2020, only 16% of all the homes that are currently in Maine were built. It's a very, very small margin. The median home price, you heard a little bit about this earlier, but I just think it's worth reiterating, went from, in 2000, $98,000. In 2021, $295,000. Why? Why did this happen? Why was there such a lull? Well, I touched on one of them, and I think to some degree it's insufficient demand. As someone who graduated high school in Maine in 2004, I went away. I thought I would never come back. I am a boomerang, and I'm very happy about it, but I am certainly not alone. And so people like me, new Mainers, people from Boston, the pandemic certainly has driven a lot of in-migration in the state, as you all know. The other component of, in addition to insufficient demand, was just, as I was talking about, restrictive and largely NIMBY-driven local zoning laws that have made it very challenging for developers. I would also just, and I didn't really write this in my notes, but I'll just make a plug that I would include in that the appeals process and all of the things that go into that, and the real lack of assurance for developers until 45 days after a permit has been issued. So there are a lot of challenges with that as well. So fast forward to today. The state's interest has changed. Where before it was primarily about public health and safety, environmental protection, now there's more. Those things are still very much at play, but now we have concerns about affordability and supply, and growing that public health piece to actually include homelessness, which is a tremendous public health problem. So the state's interest in the matters of land use and housing has been growing in the last few years. We need to build about 20,000 to 25,000 new units. You heard that statistic earlier. That's a lot of units, and the legislature in Augusta has finally caught on to this very important issue, and they are tackling it really head on, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. So in the last legislature, and this was really the first sort of shift from the state not really being involved in land use policy for a long time to dipping its toe in the water in a big way, former Speaker Ryan Fecteau led a strong effort to draft a piece of legislation and get it passed that would make changes to some of the local zoning laws that we have today. You are all familiar with it. It is what Sonia referred to as something 2003, which is LD, which stands for Legislative Document. I tried to call it the Housing Act for a while, but didn't catch on, so I just went back to LD 2003. Speaker Fecteau was interested in passing this bill and successful in passing this bill because he believed that there was not enough supply. He knew that. He also knew that it was to a great degree some local barriers that were preventing low-hanging fruit from helping remove some of these barriers. And what do I mean by that? So LD 2003 does some of those things, and they include the ability to build an ADU of right. You heard Sonia mention that. That is something we have done now in the state, and it was done through this law. To be able to put 4 units on lots that are located in a growth zone. Density bonuses for affordable housing development, and those density bonuses would include reduced parking restrictions or parking requirements. And in places where single-family homes are currently only allowed, duplexes would be allowed. That law was enacted last year. It was signed by the governor. It took effect last fall, but it has not effectively gone into effect yet. It was supposed to go into effect next week, June 1st of 2023, and that would be the date by which developers could go out and start operating under these laws, and municipalities could start operating under these laws. Without going into a very long background on this issue, suffice it to say, there has been tension between the local control and the sort of state policy that I've been talking about and building toward, and I want to take just a quick time out to talk to you about that. So You know, we've seen the state's interest change a lot over the last few decades, from the very basic environmental protection stuff to now we have affordability issues. We need more supply. The state is interested in seeing that supply get built. That rising state interest has created tension between state policymakers and municipalities, and 2003 was really the first, I think, highlight of that tension. And I am not the judge on this matter by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's a long way to be figured out and sorted out. But my perception of sort of the two sides are this, and it's the tension under which the legislature is currently trying to make decisions. The state worries that the towns aren't doing enough and or that their land use policies enable NIMBYism and create barriers to housing creation. The towns worry that broad mandates will have unintended consequences and that those policies don't respect the geographic, social, and economic differences across the state. And so that tension and balancing act is what the Maine State Legislature, the 131st, is currently working under. And I'd love to tell you a little bit about what they are working toward. So there has been a lot of attention, obviously, around housing for the last year. Bills actually had to be submitted for this legislature by last December. So interestingly, all the bills they're debating now were pretty much written and submitted by late last December. There will be more new bills introduced over time, but interestingly, they're kind of working through what I would call sort of the big brainstorm of ideas. And they sort of fall into a few buckets. Housing generally, housing building, construction, supply, labor and workforce, landlord-tenant law, and green building and or climate preparedness. And I'm gonna focus primarily on what policies are being done around housing supply rather than on these other issues. But I wanna just briefly touch on them by way of noting that legislators have a hard time. They got a lot in front of them. They have 2,000 plus bills, and they've got to work them in 12 weeks. It's an insane, crazy thing up there. And that much work can tend to lead to a lot of siloed things. So this committee's doing this over here, this committee's doing this over here, and everybody's so busy that nobody knows what everybody is doing. And so you've got a housing committee that's phenomenal, and I'm about to talk about them, that is very focused on building more housing, ensuring that at least some percentage of it is affordable to people of low income, creating workforce housing, in other words, getting the job done. In some of the other committees, they're dealing with other priorities that don't necessarily come from that same place, but are important. Things like labor, right? So as we talk about, do projects have to have labor agreements? Do they have to have union shops? Are we gonna have to build to ensure that we have solar-ready roofing? What's the carbon load on your building? Are we gonna have carbon load assessments? These are all ideas that are being floated at the Maine legislature right now. Statewide rent control. The requirement that landlords would have to convert 10% of their existing units to affordable at 80% of AMI, and affordable being 30% of income. That's a current one. That's LD 1710, if anyone's interested. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot of priorities that are competing for each other, and I'm not making a judgment on any of them. It's just that you can't have all things be the top priority. So I want to talk about the Housing Committee because they're the ones that are really prioritizing the creation of housing and driving towards solving the housing crisis that we have. What is the Housing Committee? The Housing Committee, it's interesting, there's a Labor and Housing Committee that already exists at the state legislature. This is separate but related. It is a joint select committee, which means it's not permanent. It's around for the 2 years of this legislature. It is charged with essentially taking a look at Maine's lack of housing supply and affordability and how to fix it. 57 bills have been referred to the Committee on Housing. The committee is looking at issues kind of in buckets, and so I'll just give those to you loosely. They started with homelessness, emergency assistance and aid, changes to general assistance if possible. Can they plug the gap on Section 8? These were the kinds of ideas that they started talking about. That actually led to LD2, which is a housing first policy. If you're not familiar with housing first, the idea is that rather than have to get sober or demonstrate that you've held a job for a certain period of time or other sort of requirements before you can apply or before you can qualify for this type of very low income housing, you get the housing first. That's why it's called housing first. And wraparound services are provided, and the idea is that it's very hard to do all of those other things when you don't have housing. So that is something that we expect will be funded through the governor's change package, which she just recently released, and I'm going to talk about in the last couple of minutes. So homelessness is obviously huge, and that's something they spent, I would say, about the first 2 to 3 months almost of the legislature working about and learning about. Rental assistance is one of those components. Affordability of home ownership, that's something else they're looking at. How can they incentivize it? Working with Maine Housing to understand how Maine Housing helps developers, where are the funding gaps? And also just looking at essentially how to ensure that a lot of developers and new developers and small developers get to play in the Maine market. And this is something I've been very impressed with by this committee, and so I just want to talk about it for a minute. This committee spent, as I mentioned, a couple of months getting like a very hard lesson in all of the factors that go into Maine housing and the need. The individuals on the committee have been deliberative, they have been thoughtful, and they have prioritized the need to create more housing. I've been incredibly impressed by their efforts so far, and I hope it keeps going in the same direction. I am going to give a shout out to someone in the room right now who's on the Housing Committee, and that is Senator Matt Pouliot, who has been a real champion in his party for housing creation and is just talking the right talk all the way. So if you get a chance later today, stop Senator Pouliot and ask him about some of these things that I'm talking about. So with the few minutes I have left, I just kind of want to mention some of those programs and policies that are percolating that we're going to hear more about in the next couple of months as the legislature starts to wrap up its work. LD 2003. Now wait, you say. Didn't you say that was passed last year? I did. It was passed last year, but I also spent a lot of time in this address talking about the tension between local control and the state, and it hasn't gone away, and it hasn't gone away with respect to LD 2003. Some of it has to do with timing. The Department of Economic and Community Development was, I don't want to say slow, but slow for towns to get out sort of guidance. The rules were just finalized recently. There are a lot of questions that towns have about how do we interpret, what a growth zone constitutes, or how do we know whether or not an ADU can go there, or what about this and what about that? And for all of those reasons, they feel like they don't have enough time to implement the law. For some towns, I'm just going to candidly say that that's not a good excuse. That would be like Portland, for example, which has a whole planning department and lots of people who can do this work. But then you have other really small towns who don't have any planning department, and they don't have a town council. And in fact, when they want to change their charter or their ordinances, they have to have a town meeting, which is basically a referendum on the question. So because of all of that, the Housing Committee is looking at bumping out the effectiveness of LD 2003. There are a couple of ideas out there right now. I think the one that will prevail is an extension to January 1st of 2024 for all towns, except that if the town needs to have a town meeting to do this implementation work, their deadline would be June of 2024. I will say that there is nothing stopping towns from going ahead and implementing provisions of the law today. And that is something that MEREDA and the MEREDA Local Issues Committee is going to be looking at and helping promote throughout the fall and into the winter, even if LD 2003 gets bumped out a little bit, because it's critically important that we start moving the needle on breaking down these barriers to housing creation. The last thing I'm going to make a very quick plug for a MEREDA bill, and then I want to just give you a little overview of some of the money that might be coming our way in the development community from the state related to housing. So our bill, one of the bills we have in this session, we actually have two that went before the Housing Committee, and one was voted out unanimously and relates to commercial condos and the transference of commercial condos. It's going to make it easier for affordable housing developers to do projects in mills and other places where the condo is a useful tool to divide up a building or existing property. That's very exciting. Thanks to the Housing Committee for a universal vote on that. Our other bill probably won't come up until next year. It is LD 772. In brief, it would require that a town essentially lock in its land use rules for an applicant on the day the applicant submits their land use permit. Yes, woohoo! It is a big lift, right, because of all the tension I just talked about, and it does create some potential challenges for municipalities. I'll mention, many of you may have heard of the giant flag or the mega flagpole or this big project that might go up in northern Maine. I will say that when I read that article, I thought, yeah, this would be a little bit tricky for them. So there's a little bit of work left to be done to make sure that towns like that don't get a big flagpole rammed down their throat unless they want it. But as a general matter, there is no excuse for towns not to have ordinances in 2023 that are sufficiently up to date that they are helping move the needle on the town's own stated goals for affordable housing production. There's just no excuse. So that will be LD 772, and I'll be calling upon all of you to do some grassroots action like Sonia was talking about, to call our legislators and really share the need and the impact that this would have when that time comes. And with my last minute and a half, I will tell you about the budget. So you may say, oh, they already did the budget. Nope, they sort of did the budget. They did a biennial budget that they passed at the end of March. It actually caused the legislature to adjourn, which was an oddball procedural thing, and for any of you who are, oh, that means my time's up. As I say when I'm up in committee, I will wrap up very quickly. So in the legislature passed this biennial budget, but it was essentially baseline spending. They're now looking at taking the money that was above and beyond that, plus some new projected revenues, and doing a second budget known as the supplemental budget. About $900 million will go into that budget. Currently, the governor has proposed that $80 million of that go toward housing. That includes supporting the Housing First program I mentioned, bolstering rental assistance, including rural rental assistance and emergency rental assistance, and $10 million that will help kickstart off-site construction of projects so that we can look at getting more pre-approved and pre-done housing into sites faster so that we can expedite the construction process. And that's something, there's actually a bill up in the Housing Committee right now that's looking at pre-approved housing, and it's like 1723 or something. If anyone's interested about it, you can ask myself or Matt afterwards. And with that, sort of actually relatively small glimpse into the insanity that is the Maine State Legislature and housing policy, I want to thank you all, and I will be around this afternoon, and I look forward to continuing to hopefully help move great policy forward for MEREDA and continue to collaborate with our towns and our state legislature. Thank you very much.